You're
Why
gonna
are
be
you in a
alright.
dumpster? Someone left you here. A poor
Right
girl
here.
was scavenging through the trash to survive until she found a wounded millionaire tossed aside like garbage. That encounter would change her destiny forever. Before we begin the story, I'm watching from the bustling streets of New York City. I hope you enjoy this tale. Don't forget to subscribe. The afternoon sun beat down heavily on the mountains of accumulated waste. Valerie Bellard, with her small bare feet toughened by the dirt, walked carefully among the broken glass and rusted metal, searching for any object that might gleam under the fading light. The air was thick with a sharp, penetrating smell, a mix of decay and smoke that for the 8-year-old girl was as natural as the air itself. Her mind wasn't on games or fantasy, but on the urgent need to gather enough dollars for her Grandma Rose's medicine, whose breathing had become wheezy and worrisome the night before. Each step was a mix of hope and fear, knowing that darkness brought dangers no child should ever know. Suddenly, her foot tripped over something that wasn't the hardness of metal or the fragility of plastic, but a strangely solid yet soft consistency. Looking down, her heart skipped a beat, for what lay among the debris wasn't an object, but a man dressed in a suit that, despite the dirt, showed an elegance out of place. He was motionless, his face covered in grime and a visible wound on his head, looking like a fallen angel or a demon cast out from the heaven of the wealthy. Valerie froze for a moment, torn between the instinct to run for safety and the innate compassion her grandma had instilled in her since she could remember. She crouched down slowly, holding her breath, and reached her trembling hand toward the stranger's neck to check if there was still life in that abandoned body. The man let out a guttural groan, a sound of deep pain that broke the tomb-like silence of the landfill and confirmed that death hadn't claimed its prey yet. Valerie noticed a golden gleam on the man's wrist, a watch shining with an almost insulting intensity amid so much misery and rot. She knew that if the other scavengers or the neighborhood gangs found him, they wouldn't just steal that precious item, but would probably end his life without a second thought. "Sir, wake up, please. You can't stay here," she whispered urgently, shaking the man's shoulder lightly, his eyes remaining closed under the weight of unconsciousness. The girl looked around nervously, scanning the horizon for witnesses, aware that time was running against her and night was approaching. With a superhuman effort for her small frame, Valerie tried to move him, but the man's weight was like an immovable rock anchored to the ground. She searched her backpack for a half-empty water bottle, a treasure she saved for the hottest hours, and poured a little liquid over the stranger's cracked lips. The reaction was almost immediate. The man's eyelids fluttered and opened slowly, revealing clear, disoriented eyes that didn't seem to focus on anything in particular. Where am I?" he asked in a hoarse, broken voice, trying to sit up without success as the pain forced him back down against the trash. Valerie knelt beside him, offering more water and speaking with a gentleness that contrasted with the harshness of their surroundings. "You're in the landfill on the edge of the city, sir, and you need to get up right now if you want to keep living," Valerie said with a seriousness that didn't match her childish age. The man blinked, trying to process the information, but his mind seemed like a blank slate where memories had been completely erased. He touched his head with a trembling hand, feeling the dried blood, and looked at the girl with a mix of fear and absolute gratitude. "I don't remember anything. I don't know who I am or how I got to this horrible place," he confessed, with panic starting to seep into his tone. Valerie sighed, knowing her scavenging day was over, and she now had a much more complicated mission on her hands. "It doesn't matter who you are right now. What matters is you can't stay here because it's dangerous," the girl insisted, pulling his arm with all her strength to help him sit up. The man, driven by survival instinct and the determination in the little one's eyes, made a titanic effort and managed to stand, swaying dangerously. Valerie positioned herself under his arm, serving as a human crutch, and they began to walk slowly through the labyrinth of debris. Each step was a victory against gravity and pain, as the shadows lengthened even more, threatening to engulf them completely. The girl guided the stranger through hidden paths only she knew, avoiding the main routes where malicious eyes might be lurking. During the journey, the silence between them was only broken by the man's labored breathing and the crunch of trash under their feet. "What's your name, little one?" he asked in a whisper, trying to anchor himself to some reality while his memory failed him spectacularly. "My name is Valerie," she replied without taking her eyes off the path. alert to any strange noise that might indicate danger. "Thank you, Valerie," the man murmured, feeling a wave of emotion as he realized his life depended entirely on that fragile creature. She didn't respond, focused on getting him safely to the only place she knew they'd find refuge, though she feared her grandma's reaction. As they reached the landfill's edge, the city lights began to turn on in the distance, like unreachable stars for those living on the forgotten outskirts. The man stopped for a moment, looking at his torn clothes and the watch on his wrist as if they belonged to a stranger. "Do you think I'm a criminal?" he asked the girl, tormented by the possibility that his amnesia hid a dark past. Valerie looked into his eyes, those green eyes full of confusion, and shook her head with intuitive certainty. "Criminals don't have fear in their gaze, sir, and you're terrified, so you must be a good person in trouble." They continued their march toward the compacted dirt streets where humble houses made of sheet metal and wood stood. Dogs barked as they passed, and some curtains moved discreetly, revealing the neighbors' curiosity at the strange pair. Valerie quickened her pace, feeling the man's weight becoming unbearable on her shoulders, but refusing to let him fall. She knew her grandma Rose would be angry about bringing a stranger, especially one who might bring trouble, but there was no other choice. Charity was a luxury they couldn't afford, but humanity was something they weren't willing to give up. Finally, they arrived at a small house at the end of a dead-end alley, where a warm light filtered through the cracks in the wooden door. Valerie pushed the door carefully, announcing her arrival in a soft voice so as not to scare her sick grandma. "Grandma, it's me. I brought someone who needs help," she said, while helping the man cross the threshold into the relative safety of the home. Rose, who was sitting in an old chair mending clothes, looked up and her eyes widened in surprise and alarm. "What have you done, girl?" exclaimed the elderly woman, standing up with difficulty and approaching them with a slow but firm step. The man, exhausted from the effort, collapsed onto the small worn sofa that took up much of the main room. Rose examined him critically, noting the quality of the fabric in his ruined suit and the expensive watch he wore. "Who is this man and why did you bring him to our house, Valerie?" the grandma inquired in a stern tone, though her hands were already searching for a clean rag. "I found him in the landfill, Grandma. He was hurt and doesn't remember anything. We couldn't leave him to die there," the girl explained with a plea in her voice. Rose sighed deeply, torn between the prudence needed to survive and the compassion that had always guided her life. "We don't have food even for ourselves, and now you bring another mouth to feed," grumbled Rose, though she was already heating water on the small stove. She approached the stranger and began cleaning the wound on his head with gentle, expert movements acquired from years of caring for her own. The man winced in pain but stayed still, watching the two women with silent gratitude. "Mum, I promise that as soon as I remember who I am, I'll pay you for all this," he said in a weak voice. Rose let out a dry, bitter laugh, shaking her head as she continued her improvised nursing work. "The promises of the rich are worth nothing here, sir. And you look like you're very rich, or have a lot of problems," the elderly woman declared. Valerie sat at the man's feet, looking at him curiously, wondering what kind of life he must have had before ending up in her world. Night fell completely over the neighborhood, enveloping the house in a silence broken only by the wind hitting the metal roof. The man looked at his smooth, callus-free hands, so different from Rose and Valerie's hard-working ones. He felt like an intruder in his own skin, a ghost who had landed in a harsh, alien reality. "Are you hungry?" Valerie asked suddenly, breaking his thread of dark thoughts. He nodded slightly, realizing his stomach was growling with a ferocity he didn't remember feeling before. Rose served 3 plates with a small portion of beans and handmade tortillas, putting the best part in front of the guest. They ate in silence, a silence that wasn't uncomfortable but loaded with a shared solemnity in the face of scarcity. The man savored each bite as if it were the most exquisite delicacy, discovering the true value of food. After dinner, Rose indicated he could sleep on the sofa, providing an old but clean blanket that smelled of laundry soap. "Tomorrow we'll see what to do with you, but for today you're safe here," said the grandma, turning off the main light. Valerie said goodbye with a shy smile and disappeared behind a curtain that separated her cot from the living room. The man was left alone in the darkness, listening to the nighttime sounds of the house and the neighborhood. He tried to force his mind to remember a name, a face, an address, but found only a terrifying, dark void. He touched the watch once more, seeking some clue in the cold metal, and his fingers accidentally brushed a small side button. A soft, feminine digital voice emerged from the device. "For Matthew, with all my love, Mary." The name Matthew echoed in his head, provoking an echo of familiarity, but Mary caused a strange sensation in his chest. He was Matthew. And who was Mary? Why, if she loved him, had he ended up thrown in a landfill? The questions swirled in his mind like a whirlwind, preventing him from falling asleep despite his extreme physical exhaustion. He looked toward where Valerie and Rose slept, feeling a strange connection with those two strangers who had saved his life without asking for anything. He promised himself that, no matter who he really was, he wouldn't harm them and would do everything possible to repay them. With that final thought, the man who now believed his name was Matthew surrendered to sleep, while outside the moon illuminated the landfill that had been his grave and his rebirth. The dawnlight filtered through the cracks in the wooden walls, waking Matthew with a total sense of disorientation. It took him a few seconds to remember where he was and why his body ached, as if he'd been hit by a truck. He sat up on the sofa, noticing that Rose was already awake and bustling in the small kitchen, preparing coffee that smelled of earth and cinnamon. Valerie appeared shortly after, with tousled hair and an energy that seemed to defy the poverty surrounding her. "Good morning, Matthew," said the girl naturally, testing the name he had discovered the night before. Rose turned to him with a steaming cup in hand and an inscrutable expression on her face, wrinkled by years. "So your name is Matthew?" she asked, handing him the coffee with a somewhat brusque but kind gesture. "I think so, ma'am." "The watch said that name," he replied, feeling a bit ridiculous basing his identity on a recording. The elderly woman nodded and sat across from him, crossing her arms over her chest. "Look, Matthew, we can't keep you here for long. People start talking and I don't want problems for my granddaughter." Matthew nodded, fully understanding the woman's position and feeling guilty for being a burden to them. "I understand, Rose. I'll try to leave today. I just need to know how to get to the city center," he said, trying to stand. However, as soon as he tried, an intense dizziness forced him to sit back down abruptly, and the world spun around him dizzily. Rose clucked her tongue and approached to place a cool hand on his forehead, diagnosing the situation instantly. "You're not going anywhere like this. You're weak, and that wound could get infected if you go out on the street now." Valerie looked at her grandma with pleading eyes, knowing deep down Rose couldn't throw anyone out in that state. "Can he help us around the house, Grandma, or in the garden? That way he earns his food," the girl suggested cleverly. Matthew looked at his smooth hands again, and then at the two women, feeling a determination grow inside him. "I'll do whatever is needed. I don't want to be a parasite. I'll learn to do what you need," he promised firmly. Rose stared at him for what seemed like eternal seconds, evaluating the sincerity in his green eyes before letting out a sigh of resignation. "All right, you stay a few more days, but you'll have to work," declared the grandma, pointing to the small backyard. That day, Matthew discovered that life in poverty was a full-time job, a constant struggle against lack. He learned to draw water from the well, a task that left his arms trembling and his hands sore in minutes. Valerie laughed kindly at his clumsiness, guiding him patiently and showing him tricks to avoid hurting his back. Despite the physical pain, Matthew felt a strange satisfaction seeing the bucket full of water, a tangible and real achievement. In the afternoon, while Rose rested, Valerie took Matthew to the small garden they cultivated in the scarce available land behind the house. She taught him to distinguish weeds from vegetables, talking about the plants as if they were people with their own personalities. "This is mint, it's good for stomach aches, and these are tomatoes, but they're still green," she explained enthusiastically. Matthew listened fascinated, realizing that the girl possessed a wisdom not found in books or schools. He wondered if he had children, if he had ever shared a moment like this with someone, but his memory remained an impenetrable wall. Night came again, and with it a more intimate conversation around the wobbly kitchen table. "Don't you remember anything about your family?" asked Rose, watching him as he ate with voracious appetite. "I only have sensations, fears, as if I was running from something dark," confessed Matthew, lowering his gaze to his plate. "Sometimes it's better not to remember," said Rose in a melancholic tone. "The past can be a very heavy burden." Valerie interjected, "But he must have someone looking for him, someone who loves him, like Mary." The mention of the name Mary caused a shiver in Matthew, a mix of longing and an inexplicable repulsion he couldn't decipher. Who could she be? He wondered aloud, twisting the watch on his wrist, tempted to sell it but held back by Valerie. "Don't sell it yet," the girl had told him. "It's your only connection to who you were before. You might regret it." Matthew admired Valerie's mental clarity, her ability to see beyond immediate need, unlike him who felt lost. "Maybe Mary is the reason I'm here," he murmured, and a heavy silence fell over the table. The next day, a neighbor stopped by the house and looked at Matthew with distrust, whispering something in Rose's ear before leaving. "They say there are men asking about a missing person in the next neighborhood," Rose informed him with a pale face. Matthew felt his heart stop. The instinctive fear he had felt upon waking materialized into a real threat. "Should I turn myself in? Maybe it's my family looking for me," he suggested, though every fiber of his being screamed not to. "If it were your family, they'd have gone to the police. They wouldn't be asking in the alleys," reasoned Rose with her usual shrewdness. They decided Matthew wouldn't leave the house during the day, staying hidden in the backyard or inside the home. The forced confinement gave him time to observe the dynamic between grandma and granddaughter, the unconditional love they shared. He saw how Valerie took care of Rose, making sure she took her medicines, and how Rose sacrificed to give the girl the best. It was a wealth that had nothing to do with money, a loyalty Matthew suspected he hadn't known in his previous life. "You two are millionaires and don't know it," he told them one afternoon, provoking Valerie's laughter. "Millionaires have pools and cars. We have leaks," replied the girl, laughing, but Matthew shook his head seriously. "You have something money can't buy. You have each other for real." Rose looked at him from her chair, and for the first time Matthew saw a genuine smile on the elderly woman's face. "You're a quick learner, Matthew, for a man who's forgotten everything," she said with approval. That night, Matthew slept a little better, feeling less like a stranger and more like a protector in debt. However, his dreams were invaded by fragmented images, a glass office, shouts, a cup with a bitter taste. He woke up sweating, with the name Maurice on the tip of his tongue, and a burning sensation of betrayal in his chest. He got up and went to drink water, looking out the window at the dark, lonely street. He knew his time there was limited, that the past was coming for him and bringing a storm. But he also knew that for the first time in a long time, he had something valuable to defend. At dawn on the third day, Matthew offered to repair the leaking metal roof, wanting to be useful despite the risk of being seen. While hammering carefully, he heard a conversation on the street that chilled him to the bone. It was men's voices, educated but threatening, asking about a man with a gold watch. Matthew flattened himself against the roof, holding his breath, praying they wouldn't enter the house. Valerie came out to the yard and, with astonishing naturalness, began singing a children's song, covering any noise he might have made. When the men left, Matthew came down trembling, not from fear for himself, but for what might happen to her if they found him there. "I have to go. I can't put you in danger," he told Rose as soon as he entered the kitchen. "It's too late for that, boy. If you go now, they'll catch you at the corner," she replied calmly. "We'll stay quiet and wait for the danger to pass. We're invisible to people like them." Matthew marveled at the bravery of those women, a bravery forged in daily adversity. That afternoon, the atmosphere in the house changed. They were no longer just hosts and guests. They were accomplices in a dangerous secret. Matthew told them the little he had remembered in his dream: the office, the argument, the bitter taste. "Do you think someone hurt you on purpose?" asked Valerie with wide eyes. "I'm almost sure, Valerie, and I think it was someone I trusted," he admitted with pain. The revelation bound the strange trio even closer, creating an invisible but unbreakable bond against the external threat. Days turned into weeks, and a peculiar routine settled in the small house of metal and wood. Matthew, whom the neighbors now called the distant cousin thanks to a story invented by Rose, had transformed physically. His pale skin had tanned under the relentless sun, and his hands had developed calluses where there had only been softness. He worked the land with almost religious dedication, finding in the plant's growth a metaphor for his own personal reconstruction. Valerie was his shadow and teacher, showing him how to bargain at the market and find treasures in what others discarded. "Look, Matthew, this copper is worth more if we strip the plastic," she explained one afternoon, sitting on the yard floor surrounded by old wires. He smiled, amazed by the girl's practical intelligence, and followed her instructions to the letter. He discovered that manual labor had a therapeutic effect on his fragmented mind, calming the anxiety that assaulted him at night. His relationship with Rose had also evolved. There was no longer distrust, but mutual, silent respect. She prepared home remedies for his muscle aches, and he repaired every corner of the house that needed attention. However, the threat of the suited men remained latent, like a black cloud refusing to dissipate from the horizon. Matthew avoided going out on the main streets and always wore an old cap. Valerie had gotten for him to hide his features. Sometimes he felt tempted to reclaim his previous life, to seek answers, but the fear of losing the peace he had found stopped him. "Do you miss your other life?" Valerie asked one day while watering the tomatoes that were starting to redden. "You can't miss what you don't remember, Valerie, but I miss the feeling of knowing who I am," he replied reflectively. One afternoon, while helping Rose shuck corn, the elderly woman had a small dizzy spell that alarmed Matthew deeply. "Are you taking your medicines, Rose?" he asked, holding her arm with evident concern. "They cost a lot of money, son." "I'd rather we eat well than spend on pills," she admitted with brutal honesty. Matthew felt a stab of guilt and frustration. He had a watch worth thousands on his wrist, but he couldn't sell it without risking discovery. That night, he promised to find a way to help without exposing them, though he didn't know how. The connection with Valerie grew stronger every day. She told him about her parents who had abandoned her, and he made up fantastic stories for her before bed. He had become the father figure the girl never had, and she the daughter he felt he had lost somewhere in his memory. "When I get my money back, I'll buy you all the books in the world," he promised one night. "I'd rather you stay here and tell me the stories yourself," she replied, leaving him speechless. The love growing in that house was palpable, a shield against external misery. But the outside world had cruel ways of invading their refuge. One morning, Matthew saw one of the suited men talking to the corner store owner. He recognized the sharp profile and arrogant posture. It was one of his old company's security guards, a memory that hit his mind like lightning. He ran inside with his heart pounding and alerted Rose and Valerie to hide. They spent hours in silence with the lights off, listening to the footsteps approach and then recede. The fear in Valerie's eyes ignited a cold fury in Matthew. He wouldn't let anyone harm them. "I have to go, Rose. I'm putting a target on your backs," he whispered when the danger seemed to pass. "If you go now, they'll kill you, and no one will ever know what happened," she replied with unshakable firmness. "Here we take care of you, and you take care of us. That's what family does." The word family resonated in the air, sealing a pact beyond blood. Matthew agreed to stay but began planning a strategy, not of escape, but of defense. He started noting in an old notebook everything he remembered, fragments of numbers, names, passwords that appeared in his mind like flashes. "Romero Construction," he wrote one day, and the name caused a blinding headache but also certainty. "That's my company," he told Valerie, showing her the paper with trembling hands. "Then you're the boss," she said with wide eyes. "No wonder you're so bad at gardening." They both laughed, a nervous laugh that released some of the built-up tension. However, Rose's health continued to deteriorate subtly despite Matthew's efforts to improve her diet with what they harvested. A persistent cough plagued her at night, and Matthew spent hours awake watching over her sleep with worry. He realized time was running out, not just because of his pursuers, but because of the fragility of the woman's life who had taken him in. He decided he would risk his freedom to get her a real doctor, no matter the cost. One day, while collecting cardboard, Valerie found an old newspaper and showed it to Matthew urgently. On the society page was a photo of an elegant woman and a smiling man under the headline "Business Leaders Mourn Disappearance of Partner." Matthew looked at the photo and felt nauseous. "That's them," he said in an icy voice. "My wife and my best friend." Valerie touched his hand. "Are they bad?" she asked. "They're worse than bad, Valerie. They're traitors." The revelation brought a mix of anger and clarity. Now he knew who the enemy was and why they were looking for him. They didn't want him to return. They wanted to make sure he never did, to keep everything that was his. Matthew looked at Valerie, so small and vulnerable, and swore he would reclaim his power, not for the money, but to protect her. "We're going to prepare a surprise for them," he told the girl with a new determination in his gaze. But before he could set any plan in motion, tragedy struck the humble home's door. Rose collapsed in the kitchen, clutching her chest and falling to the floor with a thud. Matthew and Valerie ran to her, shouting her name, but the elderly woman didn't respond. Panic took over the scene, erasing any thoughts of conspiracies or companies. In that moment, only Rose's life hung by a thread. Matthew scooped Rose into his arms, not caring who might see him on the street, and ran toward the main avenue seeking help. Valerie ran beside him, crying and holding her grandma's cold hand. A taxi stopped at the man's desperation, and the driver, seeing the emergency, agreed to take them to the nearest hospital. During the ride, Matthew whispered promises to Rose. "Hold on, please. Don't leave us alone." They arrived at the ER, and Matthew demanded attention with an authority he had forgotten he possessed, the authority of someone used to commanding. The doctors took Rose away on a stretcher, leaving Matthew and Valerie alone in the cold waiting room. The girl hugged him, trembling with fear, and Matthew wrapped her in his arms, feeling his own heart break. "Everything's going to be okay, little one, I promise," he said, though he wasn't sure he could keep that promise. Night. Sitting in the plastic hospital chair, Matthew understood that his previous life no longer mattered if he couldn't save the people he loved now. He looked at the gold watch, that object that had been his only identity, and made a drastic decision. He stood up carefully so as not to wake Valerie, and walked toward the exit, determined to turn that gold into life. The invisible bonds tying him to that family were now unbreakable chains of love. The public hospital was a chaos of people, antiseptic smells, and moans, a place where hope and resignation waged a constant battle. Matthew returned to the waiting room after an hour with his wrist bare and a wad of bills in his pocket, feeling a strange relief at having gotten rid of the watch. He had sold his past to secure Rose's future, getting a fair price at a nighttime pawn shop, thanks to his innate negotiating skill. Valerie woke up feeling his presence and looked at him with red eyes, immediately noticing the absence of the gold object. "You sold it?" she asked in a thread of voice, understanding the sacrifice without need for explanations. "It was just an object, Valerie. Your grandma is worth more than all the gold in the world," he assured her, stroking her messy hair. At that moment, a tired-looking doctor came out to find them with a grave expression that made Matthew's stomach tighten. "Mrs. Rose is stable, but her heart is very weak. She needs surgery and medications that Medicaid doesn't fully cover," the doctor informed. Matthew pulled out the money without hesitation. "Do what you have to do, doctor. Here's the initial payment, and I'll get more if needed." The doctor looked at the money and then at Matthew, surprised by the discrepancy between his vagabond appearance and his resources. "Very well, we'll prepare the operating room, but you should know it's a high-risk surgery at her age." Valerie let out a sob, and Matthew hugged her tightly, conveying a security he himself barely managed to maintain. The following hours were slow torture, marked by the tick-tock of a wall clock that seemed to mock their anxiety. Matthew used the time to reflect on the flashes of memory that were becoming more frequent and sharp. He remembered the face of Renee, his daughter, a teenager who looked at him with disappointment in his last clear memory. Why did she look at him like that? The pain of that memory was sharper than any physical wound. He realized he had been an absent father, a man consumed by ambition and business, neglecting the essentials. "If I get out of this, I'll fix everything," he swore to himself, looking at Valerie sleeping in his lap again. Rose's operation lasted until dawn, keeping everyone on edge. When the doctor finally came out with positive news, Matthew felt a slab lifted off him. "She came through well. She's a very strong woman," said the surgeon with a tired smile. Valerie jumped for joy and hugged Matthew, and in that hug, something unlocked in his mind. A smell, perhaps the disinfectant or the cheap perfume of a passing nurse, triggered an avalanche of memories. He saw the meeting, the cup Maurice offered him with that fake smile, and heard Mary's words. "It's better this way. Matthew, you're too stressed." The betrayal unfolded before him with brutal, cinematic clarity. It hadn't been an accident or a mugging. It had been a premeditated murder attempt by the two closest people to him. He felt a deep nausea, not physical, but moral, understanding the magnitude of human evil. But along with the anger came the memory of who he really was. Matthew Romero, a man who had built an empire from nothing. The amnesia dissipated like fog before the sun, leaving him exposed to harsh reality. "Matthew, are you okay?" "You turned very pale," Valerie asked, noticing the change in his posture and gaze. He looked at her, but no longer with the confused eyes of a castaway, but with the intensity of a captain retaking command. "I remember everything, Valerie. I know who I am and what they did to me," he confessed in a firm voice. The girl looked at him with a mix of awe and fear. "Are you going to leave now that you know you're rich?" Matthew knelt in front of her to be at her level. "I'm going to leave to reclaim what's mine, but not to be the man I was before," he promised. "I'm going to make sure you and Rose never want for anything again." Valerie nodded, trusting him, though part of her feared losing him forever in that world of wealth she didn't know. They spent Rose's recovery days in the hospital, and Matthew used that time to plan his return meticulously. He couldn't just appear, he had to do it in a way they couldn't attack him again. He used the hospital's payphone to call an old ally, a lawyer who had been sidelined by Maurice. The voice on the other end trembled upon hearing him. "Mr. Romero, everyone thought you were dead," exclaimed the lawyer. Matthew gave him precise instructions, asking for absolute discretion and to prepare the necessary documents to retake control of the company. He felt like he was playing a chess game, where his life was the king and his adoptive family the pieces he had to protect at all costs. When Rose was discharged, Matthew took them back home in a taxi, paying with the last of the watch money. The elderly woman looked at him curiously, noticing the change in his bearing, the confidence he now exuded. "You know who you are now, don't you?" she said when they settled her in bed. "Yes, Rose, and I'm sorry for bringing you trouble, but I'm going to fix everything." She smiled weakly. "You didn't bring trouble. You brought life to this old house." That night, Matthew said goodbye to them temporarily, explaining he had to face his demons alone. Valerie cried, clinging to his leg, and he had to hold back tears to not break down. "I'll be back. You have my word of honor," he said, giving her a small medal he always wore around his neck and hadn't sold. He left the house under the cover of darkness, transformed back into Matthew Romero, but with the heart of the man from the landfill. He walked toward the city, feeling each step as a declaration of war. He was going to confront Maurice and Mary, but his greatest fear wasn't them, but his daughter Renee's reaction. Would she believe the lies they'd told her? The uncertainty gnawed at him. He arrived at his ally's office at dawn, where he cleaned up and dressed in borrowed clothes that were a bit big, but restored his dignity. Looking in the mirror, he saw a different man. His hair had more grays, the wrinkles around his eyes were deeper, but his gaze had a humanity that hadn't existed before. He was ready. He got into the car the lawyer had prepared and headed toward the mansion in the upscale suburb, the place he once called home and now felt like a battlefield. The echoes of his forgotten life had stopped being whispers and become a cry for justice. The Romero mansion stood imposing, oblivious to the drama about to unfold inside. Matthew observed the facade from the car, noting that the gardeners worked as if nothing had happened, maintaining the illusion of perfection. He took a deep breath, gathering courage, and got out of the vehicle, ignoring the astonished look of the security guard who nearly dropped his radio upon seeing him. "Open the gate," Bellard ordered Matthew with his old commanding voice, and the gate opened slowly, as if the house itself recognized its rightful owner. He walked toward the main entrance, feeling adrenaline course through his veins. Upon entering, he heard laughter from the living room. It was Maurice and Mary toasting with champagne in the mid-morning. The scene turned his stomach, the traitors celebrating over his empty grave. He entered the room unannounced, and the silence that followed was absolute and tomb-like. Mary dropped the glass, which shattered against the marble floor, and Maurice turned pale as a corpse. "Surprised?" asked Matthew with icy calm, enjoying the terror in their eyes. "Matthew, my God, you're alive," stammered Mary, trying to compose an act of relieved wife, but fear betrayed her. "Save the theater, Mary. I remember everything." He cut her off dryly. Maurice tried to approach with hands raised. "Friend, you don't know how much we've searched for you. We were desperate." Matthew let out a bitter laugh. "You searched to make sure I was dead, I suppose." The confrontation became tense and verbally violent. Matthew listed every detail of the betrayal, dismantling their lies one by one. He informed them that his lawyers were already freezing the accounts and the police were on their way to investigate the attempted homicide and corporate fraud. Mary began to cry, this time for real, seeing her world of luxuries crumble, while Maurice looked for an escape, cornered like a rat. But what mattered most to Matthew wasn't in that room. "Where is Renee?" he demanded to know. "She's in her room. Don't drag her into this," pleaded Mary. Matthew went up the stairs 2 at a time, ignoring his ex-wife's shouts. He opened his daughter's bedroom door and found her with headphones on, oblivious to the chaos. Upon seeing him, the 5-year-old girl removed her headphones and froze. "Dad," she whispered, and in her eyes Matthew saw the doubt they had sown in her. "It's true you went crazy. Mom said you ran away." Matthew sat on the edge of the bed, keeping a respectful distance. "Your mother and Maurice lied to you, Renee, but I'm not here to speak ill of them, but to tell you the truth." He told her his story, omitting the sordid details to protect her, but being honest about his disappearance and who had saved him. Renee listened, processing the information, seeing the scars on her father's hands and the sincerity in his voice. "And those people, the girl and the grandma, helped you without asking for anything?" she asked incredulously. "They gave me life, Renee, when I had nothing to offer them. They taught me what it means to be a real family," replied Matthew with emotion. The girl began to cry and hugged her father, breaking the barrier of coldness that had existed between them for years. In that hug, Matthew felt he had recovered the most important thing. They went down the stairs together just as the police arrived to take Maurice, who shouted empty threats while being handcuffed. Mary remained seated on the sofa, defeated, watching as her husband and daughter looked at her with disappointment. "Leave my house, Mary," Matthew told her. "Talk to my lawyers. I'll give you what's fair, but I don't want to see you here." The woman, stripped of her arrogance, left the mansion with the opposite, facing for the first time the consequences of her actions. The house fell silent, but this time it was a cleansing silence, a new beginning. That same afternoon, Matthew took Renee to the kitchen and prepared something simple, rejecting the domestic staff's help. He wanted to serve his daughter, care for her as he had learned to do with Valerie. "Can I meet them?" Renee asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Valerie and Rose. Matthew smiled, feeling immense pride. "Of course, but you'll have to leave your expensive shoes here. We're going to a place where you walk on dirt." The trip to the outskirts was a cultural experience for Renee, who looked out the window with a mix of curiosity and horror at the poverty. When they arrived at Rose's house, the girl and the elderly woman were in the yard. Valerie ran to the car upon seeing Matthew, and he lifted her in his arms, spinning with her. "You kept your promise," she shouted happily. Matthew set Valerie down and introduced the 2 girls. "Valerie, this is Renee, my daughter. Renee, this is Valerie, my other daughter." The meeting was shy at first. Renee felt out of place in her designer clothes, and Valerie observed her with frank curiosity. "Are you rich?" Valerie asked directly. Renee blushed. "I guess so." Valerie nodded. "That doesn't matter. What's important is if you're fun." Valerie's simplicity broke the ice, and soon the 2 were sitting on the ground, talking about their very different lives now intertwined. Rose watched the scene from her chair with a satisfied smile. Matthew sat beside her and took her hand. "Thank you for giving me back my daughter," he whispered. "You saved yourself, Matthew. You just needed a push," she replied. Dinner that night was a strange mix of worlds. They ate pizza that Matthew had delivered and Rose's beans, celebrating the union of an improbable family. But Matthew knew the road wouldn't be easy. He had to rebuild his company, deal with the divorce, and heal Renee's emotional wounds. However, seeing his daughter laugh with Valerie, he knew he had the strength needed. He had paid a high price for the truth, losing his innocence and blind trust, but he had gained a clear vision of what really mattered, and that truth was priceless. Integrating Renee into Valerie's world wasn't an instant fairy tale. It was a process full of cultural clashes and painful learnings. The first time Renee tried to use the outdoor toilet at Rose's house, she came out pale and nearly crying, prompting a stifled giggle from Valerie. Matthew had to intervene, explaining to his older daughter that comfort wasn't a universal right, but a privilege. "Here there's not always running water, Renee. We have to conserve it," he gently reprimanded when she left the faucet open too long. On the other hand, Valerie visited Matthew's mansion one weekend and felt overwhelmed by the space and silence. "Why do you have so many rooms and it's just 2 people?" she asked, wandering the empty hallways. "For space," replied Renee, realizing how absurd it sounded. Valerie felt alone in that immense house, missing the warmth and constant noise of her neighborhood. However, the pool was a meeting point. There, in the water, social differences dissolved, and they were just two girls playing. School was another topic of conflict and growth. Renee, who attended an elite private school, began helping Valerie with her homework from the public school. She was horrified by the worn books and lower academic level and demanded her father do something. "She's very smart, Dad. She gets bored in that school," argued Renee passionately. Matthew, proud of his daughter's defense, decided to pay for a scholarship for Valerie at a better school, though Rose opposed at first out of pride. "It's not charity, Rose, it's justice," Matthew told her. "Valerie has a gift, and it's our responsibility to nurture it." Finally, the grandma accepted, and Valerie started attending a private school where she faced rejection from some rich classmates. Renee became her fierce protector, confronting her own elitist friends. "If you mess with her, you mess with me," Renee declared in the cafeteria, sealing her loyalty publicly and losing some superficial friendships in the process. Meanwhile, Matthew struggled to clean his company of Maurice's corruption. He discovered his partner had been laundering money, and the financial situation was precarious. He had to lay off people and restructure everything, working long hours that left him exhausted. But unlike before, now he came home sometimes to the mansion, sometimes to Rose's house, and disconnected the phone to dine with his family. He had learned that business success meant nothing if you came to an empty house. One day, Renee arrived at Rose's house with a bag of designer clothes she no longer wore. "Here, so you look pretty," she told Valerie with good intentions but little tact. Valerie looked at the clothes and then at Renee. "Thanks, but I don't need to dress like you to be pretty, and these clothes aren't good for playing in the dirt." Renee felt rejected and hurt, not understanding the lesson. Rose intervened with wisdom. "Child, the gift should please the receiver, not the giver." That afternoon, Valerie taught Renee to make dolls with scraps of old fabric. At first, Renee looked at the materials with disdain, but soon she was immersed in the creativity of making something with her own hands. When they finished, Renee looked at her crooked doll with more pride than any of her expensive toys. "I made it myself," she said, smiling. "See, that has more value," pointed out Valerie. It was an epiphany moment for the rich teenager, the value of effort and creation. The bond between the two girls deepened when Renee had her first heartbreak. A boy from her school rejected her, and she took refuge in Rose's house, crying inconsolably. Valerie, who had never had a boyfriend, listened and offered practical, direct advice. "If he doesn't want you, he's a fool, and you don't have time for fools," she said while giving her a piece of sweet bread. Renee laughed through her tears, realizing Valerie's brutal honesty was the best remedy. Matthew observed these exchanges with a full heart. He saw his two worlds, once irreconcilable, weaving into a new reality. He invited Rose to dinner at the mansion, sending a car for her. The elderly woman arrived in her best dress, simple and clean, and sat at the head of the table with a dignity no society woman could match. She treated the service staff with respect that shamed Renee for her past attitudes, teaching her another lesson without a word. However, not everything was harmony. Mary, living in a small apartment and working as a saleswoman, began calling Renee crying, blaming Matthew for her misfortune. Renee felt divided, guilty for enjoying her new life while her mother suffered. "You have to see her," Valerie surprisingly advised. "Why?" "She was mean to your dad," said Renee. "Because she's your mom, and everyone deserves a second chance. If they really want to change," replied the wise girl. Renee decided to visit her mother, finding her in a deplorable state, surrounded by unpacked boxes and bitterness. The confrontation was hard. Renee told her she couldn't keep blaming others and had to take responsibility. Mary, struck by her daughter's maturity, realized she had lost control over her. It was the start of real change for Mary, driven by shame and the desire to regain her daughter's respect. The chapter closed with a shared birthday party. Valerie turned 9, and Renee 16. Matthew organized a party in the mansion's garden, but with home-cooked food by Rose and traditional games. Seeing Renee's rich friends breaking a piñata alongside Valerie's neighborhood friends was the final proof that the walls had fallen. Two worlds had collided, yes, but instead of destroying each other, they had fused to create something stronger and more authentic. Mary's life had hit rock bottom. Fired from her store job for her haughty attitude, and with debts piling up, she faced eviction from her small apartment. Her pride, once her armor, was now a cage, preventing her from asking Matthew for help. However, hunger and desperation are powerful motivators. One rainy afternoon, she appeared at Rose's door, soaked and trembling, not from cold, but humiliation. Valerie was the one who opened the door. Seeing the woman who had conspired against her adoptive father, she felt no hate, but pity. "Come in, Mrs. Mary," she said, stepping aside. Mary entered, looking at the dirt floor and humble walls with a mix of horror and resignation. Rose, who was sewing, stood up slowly. "What have you come for?" she asked without beating around the bush. "I have nowhere to go." "Renee told me you don't turn anyone away," whispered Mary, breaking into tears. Matthew arrived shortly after and found his ex-wife sitting at his table, drinking coffee served by the woman she had despised. The tension in the room was palpable. "I won't give you money, Mary. You already spent it all on appearances," said Matthew harshly. "I don't want money. I need a place and work," she pleaded. Rose intervened. "You can stay here, but you'll have to earn your bread. Here no one eats for free, not even dethroned queens." Thus began Mary's ordeal and redemption. Rose assigned her the dirtiest tasks, cleaning the chicken coop, hand-washing clothes, and scrubbing floors. At first, Mary complained about everything. Her manicured hands blistered, and her back ached constantly. But Rose was relentless. If Mary didn't work, she didn't eat. Valerie, in her way, tried to encourage her. "Look, if you do it this way, it's faster," she taught, reversing the roles of social superiority. There were nights when Mary planned to run away, steal something, and disappear. But the disappointed look she imagined on Renee stopped her. Her daughter visited on weekends, and to Mary's surprise, she seemed prouder seeing her scrubbing dishes than when she saw her organizing charity galas. "You're fighting, Mom. That's brave," Renee told her one day, hugging her despite the smell of bleach. That hug was the fuel Mary needed to continue. Little by little, the hard work began to transform not just her hands, but her spirit. She stopped worrying about breaking a nail and started worrying about whether the plants had enough water. She discovered she had a talent for organization and began helping Rose manage the house expenses and garden sales better. "We can sell the jams at the downtown market. They'd pay more," she suggested one day, and Rose, surprised, agreed to try. The jam business was a moderate success, and Mary felt for the first time the satisfaction of earning money through her own real effort. Matthew observed the change with skepticism at first, but had to admit the superficial woman he knew was dying to give way to someone more human. One day he found her teaching Valerie table manners, but not with arrogance, but affection, like an exchange of knowledge. "You teach me to be strong, I teach you to be elegant," she told the girl. The test of fire came when Maurice, out on bail, tried to contact Mary to propose a new fraudulent scheme. She met him at a cafe, and Matthew, fearing a relapse, followed her discreetly. He heard Mary reject Maurice firmly. "I'm not that person anymore, Maurice. I'm poor, but I sleep peacefully at night," she said before leaving. Matthew felt ashamed for doubting her, and that night he offered her a legitimate job at his company, in a low but dignified position. Mary turned down Matthew's offer. "I need to do it on my own, Matthew. If I go back to your shadow, I'll never know if I can stand on my own." She decided to use her skills to start a small business organizing budget events in the neighborhood, using Rose's network of contacts. It was humble at first, organizing sweet 16s and baptisms, but she put all her old high society experience into it, adapted to limited resources. The community, which at first looked at her with suspicion, began to accept her. They called her Miss Patty and came to her for style or decoration advice. Mary discovered that the admiration of her poor neighbors felt more genuine than the flattery of her old rich friends. She had earned her place in the world, not by her last name or her husband's money, but by her work and service to others. A year after her arrival, Mary could rent her own place, a simple apartment near Rose's house. The farewell was emotional. She hugged Rose tightly, whispering a thank you from the bottom of her soul. "You'll always have a plate at my table," replied the elderly woman. Valerie gave her a drawing of the three of them together, Rose, Valerie, and Mary, titled The Strong Women. Matthew, seeing his ex-wife's transformation, could finally forgive her completely. The hate and resentment dissolved, giving way to cautious respect and friendship for Renee's sake. Mary had fallen from the highest heights, but upon hitting the ground, she had found the foundations to build a true life. Her redemption wasn't a miracle, it was a daily construction, brick by brick, of humility and courage. The years passed like leaves carried by the autumn wind. Rose's small house had seen incredible transformations. Now it had a new roof, a polished concrete floor, and an extra room that Matthew had insisted on building. But the home's essence remained intact. Valerie, now a university student, studied medicine with the same passion she once had for scavenging treasures in the trash. Her dream of healing her own was materializing thanks to her effort and the unconditional support of her peculiar family. Renee had graduated in architecture and worked side by side with Matthew at the construction company, designing affordable housing. Romero Construction no longer sought only profit but social impact, becoming an ethical model in the sector. The two sisters, united not by blood but by destiny, were inseparable, sharing secrets, clothes, and dreams. Matthew, with his hair now completely white, looked at them with the pride of someone who had cultivated the world's most beautiful garden. However, time, generous in wisdom, is stingy in health. Rose, the iron matriarch, began to fade slowly. Her steps shortened, her breathing more labored, and her hands trembled holding the coffee cup. Valerie, with her medical knowledge, knew her grandma's heart was reaching its limit. She tried all treatments, consulted her professors, but old age is a disease with no cure, only care. The house became a sanctuary of peace for Rose. Mary, Matthew, Renee, and Valerie took turns caring for her, returning every gram of love she had given them. Mary read novels to her in the afternoons. Renee showed her building plans, and Matthew simply sat by her side, holding her hand in silent gratitude. Rose never complained, facing the end with the same bravery she had faced poverty. "Don't cry for me when I'm gone," she told them one night when they were all gathered around her bed. "I've had a rich life, full of people who love me. What more can an old woman ask?" Valerie fought to hold back tears, feeling like a part of her was being torn away. "Don't go yet, Grandma. You have to see me graduate," she pleaded. Rose caressed her cheek with infinite tenderness. "I'll see you, my girl, from the best seat in heaven." Valerie's graduation day arrived, and Rose, against all medical odds, asked to attend. Matthew hired a private ambulance and nurse to accompany her. In the auditorium, when Valerie went up to the stage to receive her degree with honors, she looked for Rose in the front row. The elderly woman, weak but radiant, raised her hand in a victory sign. It was the pinnacle of her life, seeing the landfill girl become a doctor. Weeks after graduation, Rose called the family for one last dinner. She requested her favorite dishes and, drawing strength from weakness, sat at the table with them. They laughed, recalling anecdotes. The day Matthew didn't know how to use the outhouse, Mary's first time washing a dish, Renee and Valerie's girl fights. It was a farewell disguised as celebration, full of love and nostalgia. Rose looked at each one, etching their faces into her eternal memory. That same night, Rose passed away in her sleep with a peaceful smile on her face. Valerie was the one who found her, and though the pain was heartbreaking, she felt immense peace knowing her grandma had gone without suffering. The wake was crowded. People from the whole neighborhood and high society came to say goodbye to the woman who had united two worlds. There was no class distinction in the grief. Everyone mourned the same mother. Matthew ensured her grave was the most beautiful in the cemetery, always covered with fresh flowers from the garden she loved so much. "She saved my life," said Matthew in his eulogy. "Not just my body, but my soul." Mary also spoke, thanking the woman who taught her the dignity of work. But it was Valerie who closed the ceremony. "My grandma didn't leave me a monetary inheritance. She left me an inheritance of love that never runs out." The grieving was a slow process, but the family stayed united, supporting each other as Rose had taught them. The house felt empty without her, but her spirit was in every corner, in the coffee smell, in the yard plants, in the family's union. They decided not to sell the house but turn it into a free medical foundation run by Valerie, thus fulfilling the dream of helping the community. Life continued, as it always does. Valerie met Alex, an idealistic doctor who shared her passion for service. They fell in love between hospital shifts and volunteer days. When Alex proposed, he did it in Rose's house yard under the lemon tree. Valerie accepted, knowing her grandma would have approved of that good, simple man. Matthew, seeing his adoptive daughter happy, felt his mission was complete. He had closed the cycle. From being a lost man in the trash, he had become the patriarch of an extraordinary family. He looked at the sky and winked, imagining Rose scolding the angels for not keeping heaven clean enough. The cycle of life had turned, bringing death but also the promise of new life. Valerie and Alex's wedding was the event of the year, not for its luxury, but for its overflowing joy. It was held in the garden of Rose's old house, now transformed into the Rose Clinic. There were strings of lights hanging from the trees and long tables where doctors, architects, neighborhood folks, and Matthew's old partners mixed. It was a mosaic of humanity, just as Rose would have wanted. Matthew walked Valerie down the aisle arm in arm, both with tears in their eyes. "You look beautiful, daughter," he said with a broken voice. "Thanks, Dad," she replied. And that word, Dad, said so naturally, was the best gift Matthew could receive. Mary and Renee were in the front row, crying with emotion, dressed elegantly but without ostentation. The ceremony was simple, focused on the commitment to serve the world together and love each other. During the party, Matthew took the microphone for a toast. "Many years ago, I arrived at this place broken and without memory. A girl and her grandma picked me up and fixed me. Today I see that girl become a woman and wife, and I realized the real treasure wasn't what I had in the bank, but what I found in this landfill." The applause echoed in the night, and Valerie ran to hug him. It was a moment of pure happiness frozen in time. Shortly after the wedding, Valerie announced she was pregnant. The news was received with jubilation. Matthew, who already felt like a grandpa from the children Renee planned to have, was thrilled. "I'm going to spoil that child terribly," he joked threateningly. Mary was already knitting baby clothes, a skill she had perfected over the years. The family prepared to welcome the new generation, eager to pass on their story. The day the baby was born, a healthy, strong girl, they decided to name her Susanna Rose in honor of the great-grandma. When Matthew held little Susanna in his arms for the first time, he felt the weight of continuity. He whispered in her ear the story of how her grandpa had been found in the trash and how love had rescued him. The baby looked at him with big, curious eyes, as if understanding every word. The Rose Clinic prospered under Valerie and Alex's direction. It became a beacon of hope for the neighborhood, offering quality care to those who couldn't afford it. Renee designed a modern, functional expansion, and Mary organized fundraising events. Everyone contributed their talent to keep the legacy of generosity alive. Matthew spent his afternoons there telling stories to the children in the waiting room, becoming the neighborhood's storytelling grandpa. One day, years later, Matthew strolled with his granddaughter Susanna, now 5, near the place where he had been found. The landfill had been closed and turned into a green park, thanks to Matthew's company efforts. "Was it here, Grandpa?" the girl asked, pointing to a grassy mound. "It was here, my love. Here is where my life ended and started again." The girl squeezed his hand. "You were lucky, Grandpa." "Yes, Susanna. I was lucky to lose everything to find the only thing that mattered," he replied. They sat on a bench watching the sun set over the city, tinting the sky orange and violet. Matthew thought of Maurice, who had died alone in prison, and felt a pang of sadness for him, but no resentment. Life had put everyone in their place. He was surrounded by love, peace, and purpose. The family gathered every Sunday at the clinic house for meals. The table was always full, noisy, and chaotic, with plates passing hand to hand and laughter shaking the windows. It was an imperfect family, patched together, sewn with threads of different colors and textures, but indestructible. They had learned that wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in the number of hands that hold you when you fall. On the clinic's main wall was a large photo of Rose, smiling with that knowing, mischievous look. Below, a gold plaque read, "Here we cure bodies, but we heal with love." Matthew looked at the photo, raised his wineglass to her, and smiled. He had kept his promise. He had protected his own, learned to love, and left a legacy that would endure beyond his own life. Valerie approached and put her arm around his shoulders. "What are you thinking, old man?" she asked affectionately. That I'm the richest man in the world, doctor, he replied. And as the sun finished setting, giving way to the stars, Matthew knew his story. The tale of the millionaire and the landfill girl wasn't a fairy tale, but a lesson in humanity that would continue resonating in the hearts of those who knew it forever. The eternal legacy wasn't the money. It was love transformed into action. If you enjoyed this story, we'd appreciate it if you rated it from 1 to 10. Support us with a like and subscribe to our channel Tales of Kindness. Comment from what place you're watching us. Thanks for your unconditional support in every story. Blessings to you and your family. M.